Well, hello there, and welcome back to another episode of Help My Business is Growing, a podcast where we explore how to grow and build a business that is healthy and sustainable. I'm your host, Kathy Svitina. As a business owner, there will be times when you will need to have difficult conversations, whether it's going to be with your employees or clients and customers. There definitely will be a time. And these conversations can get stressful and uncomfortable. And let's face it, it can get easy to procrastinate and avoid having these talks and just put your head in the sand and pretend everything is fine. Yes, everything is fine. But the problem is when you're putting them off, this can lead to even bigger problems for the business down the line. So the question here is, how do you make these conversations a little bit easier on yourself and on the person that you have to have a conversation with? And also, how do you make them less intimidating and more productive? A quick reminder, all of the episodes on this podcast, including this one, come with timestamps for topics that we discuss, and each one has its own blog post as well. You can find all of the links and the detailed topics in this episode show notes. My guest today is Sheila Lambert. She is the president and founder of Lambert Leadership Coaching, and she brings over 30 years of experience as a therapist and executive coach, empowering thousands of women who advance in their careers and are at the forefront of their companies through self-discovery. She is a licensed counselor, a certified workplace wellness professional, and a stress mastery coach as well. She is also a speaker and a leaders advocate, and she supports and donates percentages of proceeds from her business to many nonprofit organizations, especially the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, as she has had many people in her life succumb to cancer. Join us. Welcome to the show, Sheila.
Thank you so much, Kathy. I'm so happy to be here.
Thanks so much for being here. It's going to be a great conversation. And we've had this particular topic on the podcast before, but I really wanted to dive deeper on it because we're going to be discussing how to have difficult conversation with employees and with clients. And it's a conversation that many of us avoid because of fear of confrontations, or we're just not sure how to approach it. Sometimes even see people sticking their heads in the sand and hoping that it will quietly go away, but it almost never does, obviously. And it feels like you're just trying to cross this rickety bridge over a rushing water, but you know you have to do it to get to the other side, but it's super, super uncomfortable. So what we're going to be focusing on this episode is how do we make this easier? And I think the way to make it easier is to, at least what I've seen for myself, is to prepare yourself for it at least. But how should you prepare yourself? Because, these type of conversations could be nerve-wracking, even if you've done them before.
That is the $1 million question, Kathy. And it is something that is really the preparation for a conversation is actually the most important part of a conversation. Mm-hmm. The actual conversation is important, but the preparation for it, as you said, is ultra important. And so I have so much to say about that. The first and foremost thing I think I want to say is that there's different types of conversations. So it's also important to be able to pause and say, what kind of a conversation do I anticipate entering? And is this conversation about me? Is this conversation about the other person? Or is this conversation actually about a situation? So when I'm thinking about me, so preparing myself for things like, what did I say that might have brought me to this conflict that brings me to having to have this difficult conversation? And then what did I mean, or what could have the other person meant? So the type of conversation for myself, it's really kind of digging deep into what's going on in my mind. Am I telling myself any stories? Is this real? Yep. Is it not real? So, I think I just want to start with that part of it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does actually, because there's so many times that I've noticed too, you have this one story in your head, what might be happening. But when you actually start having a conversation and you're listening to the other person, you realize that what you thought is actually completely the opposite of what is going in the other person's mind. And you also talked about the particular situation. So it's almost going to the root of the cause of what is causing this uncomfortable situation. But what are some of you said the story in your head could be one of them, but how about the other person in the situation? Can we unpack that a little bit more?
Yes. And I think the preparing in my mind is part of unpacking it. So I think setting that stage for what is going on inside of me and what do I need to leave at the door so that I can then focus on the other person, right?
Yep.
That's really important because the stories can then move on and we're suddenly coming up with what the other person might be saying back to us, haven't even entered the door yet. Right. I know for myself, I've done that a lot of times. And my clients, they share stories where they've done that before. So setting that stage and being clear on what do I need to leave behind in order to understand who this person is. And I might not even be getting to your answer, Kathy, and I know we'll kind of dig deeper, but I think some of the other preparation is, who is this other person? Why is it that I'm anticipating this to be a difficult conversation? Again, it could have been a previous conversation that erupted or progressed into conflict, or it could be my own stuff that's getting in the way and thinking it's going to be a difficult conversation. But being able to try and understand where this other person either came from or who this other person is that I have to make sure I accommodate, right? Instead of treating the person behind the door I'm about to enter as the same person that I always have a conversation with. So in thinking about an individual where maybe there was a conflict and now I'm prepared, or there was an issue and I'm preparing for that difficult conversation, I think one of the things that I have found to be real important is to be able to ask myself, could something else be going on with this person? Now, I might not know it, but if we work with each other and if it's someone that is being managed by the individual or that is a teammate, or a manager for that matter, so it could be on the same level, up or down, normally we know who the person typically is or how they show up. So if there's a change, is the change because of me? Or is the change maybe because there's something else going on and that I need to try and understand that before jumping right into the conversation?
That makes sense. And I always like to bring this down to very specific levels because I think it would be a lot easier if we come up with an example, like a real life example where someone needs to have a difficult conversation. And do you have any examples like that when a client of yours, or maybe you had it, where you had to have a difficult conversation? And can you walk us through, like, what were some of the preparations that you had or the client had to do? And how did that affect the conversation itself?
Yes, there's so many examples that come to my mind. Let me share with you a past client that I've worked with for many years, and this individual, this woman was advancing in her career and was struggling with a change in her upper manager or vice president, I should say. And so she was doing so well in her work and advancing and had large teams. And then this new person came in, and suddenly she was finding herself having these roadblocks of not feeling heard, not getting validated, not being able to execute on recommendations. And so, there was this internal conflict she was having. And so we worked on preparing for the ultimate conversation. The ultimate conversation meaning it's been now a long period of time that I've been reporting to you. So it's time now to have the conversation. So one of the things that she had to really do some work on, which is a step in that having a difficult conversation, is those stories I mentioned earlier. She had to really put them in its place. She had to identify what was really happening, and was she really being questioned? Why was she feeling she was not being validated? Was that real? And get or let go of the saboteur thinking, because what was happening was that she was starting to think, I just don't think I can be here anymore. So she went from this great tenure as an employee and as a leader, and then this one change really created this self-doubt, and the self-doubt perpetuated. and lived in her head. And I think really got in the way of her understanding her manager. And so once she was able to go in, to set the stage first through some work, and then devise a plan. And we can talk about maybe what some of the plans are, but devise the plan and then go in with confidence and actual examples of questions. She was able to execute a really good conversation. And I remember her saying, I suddenly felt like this person that I was reporting to was human, right? She was no longer my boss. She was a human being. And once I asked some really open-ended, powerful questions to her, which we prepared for, her manager was able to say, oh, wow, I didn't realize that was what you were feeling. And the reason why I manage this way is because of XYZ.
Yeah.
And suddenly, like this power differential that my client was feeling and creating a little bit of herself became more normalized. And when that happened, there was a shift. There was a shift in the trust. There was a shift in the openness. And it wasn't that she was looking to hear everything. She knew she might not hear something she wanted to. Like, do you know what I'm saying? But she just knew she wanted to open up that conversation. And so for her, that was really helpful. And I find that to be really common, right? So once we can get the stories out, rewire our self-doubt, and prepare enough for the conversation with tactical tools and feel armed, like going into a meeting with the questions in front of me and the things I need to let go behind me, and just kind of some breathing and really some presence in active listening, that's really where the magic begins to happen.
This is interesting because when I work with business owners, they're on the opposite side of this, where they are the person that the employee has an issue with. And a lot of times it's because the employee is reluctant about the changes that are happening in the business. So it's good to hear the other side of how the employee might be feeling and how are they processing this in their head. The question that I have here is, let's say that you do have an employee who feels this way and you're the manager and you know you've seen the sign, the person is being more quiet in the meetings, or maybe they're feeling more resentful. There's just something. Usually what I've noticed is there's nothing that you can put your finger on what exactly it is. It's just this general energy and vibe and feeling that you have with the person.
Yes.
Is there anything as a manager, as a business owner, if you have an employee like that you know is struggling, or you have a feeling that is struggling, is there anything that you can do to make this easier for them or coach them or guide them to have that conversation with you?
Absolutely. The most important thing is not to ignore it, Kathy. So many people ignore it and hope that it goes away. To your point earlier, do not ignore it. The second is understand where, and I'm assuming then that this person is acting different, right?
Yeah.
So when that person acts different, there is something going on. So opening up that conversation. So it's similar tools, setting the stage, setting up the meetings to have private, open conversations. Try and come towards that person in a caring, compassionate way, using open-ended questions. I see that there's been a change in how you've been at meetings, and I just want to open up the conversation and ask if you're okay. I'm wondering if there's something we can talk about that I can be helpful with. Has there something that's changed? Can you help me to understand that about your silence? Right? So open-ended, careful, right? I always caution the people I work with not to go to that employee and say, why are you acting different? Why can put someone on the defense? How come can make someone feel not safe? And really what you described, which is part of the work I do and with leaders, with organizations, with business owners, is working on who have teams, working on creating a psychologically safe culture. And when there's a change similar to what you described, sometimes the person, the employee or the team is feeling unsafe, is feeling like they can't speak up for some reason. And sometimes it's the business owner or it's the leader who's causing that, and sometimes it's not. So the signs are important to look at and actually see. Some people have the obstacle, they put obstacles in their way, or they don't look at the obstacles to remove. And those obstacles sometimes are time. I'm too busy. And so, therefore, the busyness gets in the way of really looking at the employee and the behavior change. So I say, don't ignore it. Look at what's happening around the environment. Look at yourself as a business owner and as a leader and say, what am I doing, if anything, to create this shift in culture? What do I need to look at within myself? And then have that really good, even conversation using some powerful open ended questions to engage and figure it out.
Yeah. And I would say also the busyness, it sometimes can be a pretense of avoidance. There's a problem and you're constantly busy, but that busy is a very convenient excuse to just run away and avoid the situation because no, not this week, not this week, not this week. And before you know it, a month has come by and you still haven't had the conversation. But we've talked about if the employee is a little bit avoidant as well and is starting to be more distant. But what about if you have an employee who is more open and verbal about the stuff that they don't like and they're actually being argumentative in front of your team and other people? I've seen that as well, especially because, again, the companies that I work with, they go through a lot of changes. And not everyone's going to be on the same page with you. And you might get into a situation when you are communicating that to the team in a meeting, and then you have one person that is completely closed off and starts to argue with you in front of the team. How do you handle that?
That's a great question. What an uncomfortable position for everyone. Really, I've been there before from all different angles, to be honest with you. I think as part of setting the stage or part of setting the tone in meetings, there needs to be some ground rules. So if it's an established team meeting or a new team meeting, it's always good to reestablish what the ground rules of the meeting are. We're here to have open conversations. The expectation of the team is to respect people's differences. It's okay to disagree. Here are the ways that, as your team leader, I want us to agree on as far as how we're going to disagree. So I think setting the stage, and sometimes that's done in quarterly or annual or semi-annual retreats where there's real business planning and team building. I oftentimes encourage teams when they bring me in to do retreats to have their business items, including things like that before actual retreat stuff. But I think setting the stage and having the conversations about what the meetings need to look like are important. So that's the first thing. I'm all about setting the stage, Kathy. Can you tell?
And then planning ahead, yes.
And then after that, when things bubble, it's okay to allow it to bubble to a degree. But as the leader, right, the leader really needs to be the one in charge, not to close it down at certain points, but to say, okay, wow, it sounds like we really do have some differences of how we're looking at this situation. And person, it sounds like you're really struggling a little bit. So how can the team help talk this through? Or how can you move beyond this? Or another tactic could be, it sounds like we've kind of reached our maxes in working through this issue, and we've gotten some great feedback and we've reached some crossroads. So I'd like to try and regroup right now. And this person who's argumentative, let's just take this offline and talk through some of the things I think you're bringing up. I want to get back to our meeting. I want to get back to, right. So there's a way to redirect in the meeting. And then most important, and absolutely a conversation with that person privately around their behavior. Because we can open up a conversation, we can have our active listening, we can create a psychologically safe culture, we can allow people to have differences and identify them and name them. But when there is someone like that, it can take away all the work that the organization has done and create a culture of drama and negativity and toxicity. And nobody wants to live in that. And that's where organizations struggle with retention.
Yeah. I mean, it just sucks all the energy and all the oxygen out of the room. You can just feel it. And it's very uncomfortable for the people who are in the room witnessing this as well, is because it's very cringy. That I will say that it's very cringeworthy to be in a room where this is happening. And I've been in a couple of rooms like that, and it's just, oh, just get me out of here. So you said redirecting and then having a private conversation afterwards. So let's talk a little bit about this private conversation afterwards. How would that look like? Should you, as they say, do not ever write an email when you're angry, just wait. Should you wait a day or two, maybe a week or two to address this? Or should you address it right after? Like, what is the time frame? And how would you have that conversation? Like, how would that look like?
Yeah. I think a lot of my answer is different depending upon the person. So is this someone who this is the first time that this has happened? I'd give it a little time that day, give them some space, check in with them, circle back with them, try and engage with them that day, I think, right, for the most part. If it's somewhere there's been some buildup, progression, or ongoing, again, depends on the person. Is there previous write-ups on that person, right? So there's different things to look at to determine next steps. That individual, I might then make sure HR is pulled in to that conversation to come up with the right plan for next steps. If it's someone that there's a really good relationship with, and even if it's not the first time, but it's not really a problem, and it could be relating a situation, I'd still circle back with that person fairly soon, because what's hard too is for everyone leaving for that day, right? The manager and the employees. So I think managers, right, this is part of being a leader, is learning and get training in the areas of when do I execute now versus when do I wait a little bit. Now, one key component is for that leader, like I need to make sure my emotions are in check. If I'm really angry about what happened and how they derailed the meeting, having it right away might not be the right thing. I know for me, I need some time. I need to breathe. I need to make sure my emotions are in check. And that's where that difficult conversation comes in. And then meeting with the individual and opening it up and having some clear objectives.
Is there any common words or phrases that would make this particularly effective when you have this meeting? And I know I'm not asking for like formulas of it, but it would be really good to have something in your back pocket that you can say, well, this is maybe how I can phrase something like this so that it's more neutral versus negative, and so that you have that objectivity and you're not coming, even though you might have cooled off, it could be still that when you think about that particular event, you still get angry. So, is there anything that would help when you're in that situation?
I think non-judgmental questions at first to try and open up the conversation and not come at the person. I think that's important. So something like, you had obvious signs of you were upset during the meeting. It was clear to myself and everyone that you were upset. Can you please help me understand where those emotions were coming from? Can you share a little bit about the position that you were feeling in there? Right? It says, all right, I want to hear your side.
Mhm.
And sometimes when that happens, the other person just starts coming down a little bit. Now, again, space, to your point earlier, might be important. Okay, so then the person shares, maybe they're still elevated, then maybe ramping up the question a little bit. Still open, but maybe a little bit more. I understand you're saying you had a difficult time with that. I'm really trying to engage in a conversation with you to try and help you and try and help the team. I can't do that if you're coming from a place of judgment. I want you to try and think about how we can have this open conversation in a productive way. Again, sometimes it says to someone, ooh, okay, so it's ramped up. Let's just say, Kathy, the person still is ramped up. I think at that point, the leader says, okay, sounds like you're not really at the point of being able to have this conversation. The reality is, I'm going to recommend for you to take some time and think about how you acted at that meeting and how you're going to rectify that. And I'd like to have a follow-up meeting with you. So I think that's where a leader needs to step into, right? We can open up the conversation. We can try and meet them where they're at. We can try and understand where they're at. But at some point, it's about, all right, now we have to shift and be in charge. And I don't mean in a dictator way, but be in charge. So that might say, I'm going to give you a day home. Like, why don't you take a mental health day? I'd like you to take a day off. Why do you work from home? Whatever the case may be. Or jumping right into, let's have a meeting in 2 days. And tomorrow I will email you with the questions that I want you to be prepared for. right? So the leader can take charge and just say, I'm going to get this on paper just so you have an understanding of what I'm looking for. Give the person time to calm down, give the person time to come up with their position. But in that case, I would really come up with 3 objectives. So as the leader, I'd recommend, what are my objectives for the meeting? It might not be resolving the problem, but it might be understanding the individual and where they're coming from. It might be making sure the individual walks away with understanding that behavior can't happen.
Yeah.
And it might be, another one might be coming up with next steps, right? So 3 objectives for the conversation. And then therefore there's some structure to the conversation. The individual's prepared for it. And then they know it's a little bit like, I think this is more than just my opinion. This is something I need to look at. And I always say at the end of a conversation, we haven't gotten there yet, I know, but at the end of a conversation, summarize, wrap up, set the next meeting already. And then both people should be walking away with, this is what I have to do or work on before the next meeting.
And would you also send the summary of it in an email, or would you just summarize it in the meeting as well?
I think at that point, documentation is huge.
Okay.
And 2 reasons why I'd say yes to the documentation. One, it's really important, right, for being able to track employee performance. And when it gets to the point of performance improvement plans, we need documentation. But 2, sometimes people's emotions get in the way of understanding and hearing from the meeting. So having a follow-up can be a good reminder and can help that visual person to get out of the emotion and into. So having that structured email or follow-up at this level is important. Some people have already established that, right? Because when I work with people, I encourage, when you're working with a team, establish what type of communication is important as you move forward. So that might already have been established, or if it's not, I would definitely get that in place.
Yeah, that makes sense. And this is an interesting perspective too, because now as we are working more globally, and it might be that you have remote workers, you might have, some outsourced staff or whatever it might be, that are not in the same culture as you. So that brings an extra layer of complexity of having these difficult conversations. So are there any cultural differences that you have to keep in mind when you're having these difficult conversations with employees or clients from different cultures? Like, how do you handle that? I know this is a very packed question, but is there any general guidance that you can give us there?
I don't even know if I have all the right answers to that question, but I will tell you that I'm a true believer in, at the beginning of that manager supervisee or supervisor supervisee relationship, understanding the person you're managing. I also encourage understanding your manager. So certainly understanding needs to be all encompassing, not only who is this person as an employee, but what are the factors in that person's life that brings them to who they are? What's important to them in their life, which includes their culture.
Yeah.
How can I best support them in their work here, which includes their culture? There's a tool that I use when I work with individual leaders as well as organizations, individual leaders, to help them have those conversations and set that stage for developing that understanding, let's just say. And I also do this with teams when I'm working with them. But there's clear questions that helps things like, what's most important to you? How do you want to be celebrated? What are some misperceptions that people have of you? So I think that beginning developing of that relationship can be where a manager begins to understand those cultural differences, especially if you know what the culture is a little bit, then we can dig deeper. What's important to you that you want us to celebrate for you and with you? And then I would also look at how to reverse that. Because yes, we want leaders to support their teams and their individuals around their culture. And it's important as managers and leaders to communicate what's important to us so that there's a shared inclusivity, shared relationship and understanding.
Yeah, and I think as a business owner myself, I think of this as the company that you own and you started and you're working in, and you have a certain vision and you have certain values in the company. Even if you have no idea what they are, they are definitely that there. You just have not articulated them yet enough, but they are definitely there. And I think for me, the way how I have managed that in my own business, because I work a lot with people in different cultures, is I have a certain guidelines that I communicate that up front. One of the things, the biggest one, is the mistakes are okay, that everyone is human. We all make mistakes. And I would rather have them tell me and say, this is what went wrong, and we can fix it together, versus someone trying to hide it or feel bad about it or whatever it is. So that is one of the core values that I have for my business, is that we're human, mistakes are fine, just tell me about it versus trying to hide it. And I think that's very important to articulate those type of things, whether it's on a company level and how it is to work with you as an individual.
Yeah, I love that. I love that you mentioned the word values. And I think what you just said, as far as how you set that stage with people, I'm going to use because I love it so much. But the value piece is critical, right? So there's a few different levels of that. I'm glad you mentioned it. Values is what gives me joy, as you know, right? That's why you just described what you do with your business. But values is connecting our values with the company values is also what gives people energy.
Yeah.
Right. So I believe that understanding people and where they come from and what's important to them and what their values are is critical in setting the stage for that open dialogue and communication. And it's also critical for businesses to have their own value statements, but then to have employees engage in that process as well, so they can understand it, feel a part of it, share their values, and see where there's alignment for energy and motivation. So I'm adding in an extra piece that you didn't ask, but I think that that's kind of what was coming up for me when you shared that.
Yeah, and as we were talking about this, I always have this. I have a lot of mental images in my head. What I think about these is kind of analogies. Is when you don't have values and you don't have these guidelines in the company, it feels like everyone is in a boat and everyone's rowing in different directions.
Yeah.
So what's going to happen? There's going to be a lot of issues. You're not going to get anywhere. You're going to be stagnating. It's just going to be really hard to move forward. But once you have that, everyone now is rowing into the right direction, the direction that you want to go as a leader, and everyone is doing their part. Because obviously, if you're leading the ship, you cannot be rowing as well. You're just going to get exhausted. That's where overworking and overburning yourself comes out. But if you're directing, steering the ship, and then you have people rowing in the same direction, makes this so much easier, so much better.
That's right. Absolutely. And the piece that you mentioned, as far as setting the tone of it's okay to make a mistake, right? Even making a mistake, but sharing it. I made a mistake. I would have done it this way next time. I'm still seeing people rowing together, right? It's just bringing in those values of authenticity. And yeah.
So Sheila, we had a really great conversation. Thank you so much for this. But I always ask this, every single guest that comes to this podcast, is I want to give someone something, listeners, actionable steps that they can do in the next week or two. So if someone, let's say, that has a difficult conversation that they need to have, and I don't really want to do this. I still do not want to do this. I need to do this, but I don't want to. Like, what is the one thing that they can do in the next week or two, or hopefully sooner, if it's a conversation that they need to have as soon as possible, to get them to that conversation in the most productive way?
Yeah. All in one. I think one of the most critical first steps is self-care, right? If that person doesn't have time to rest, to take care of their human basic needs, and to put their stuff aside, it's not going to be productive. The second is prepare, like we talked about. Then, of course, the third is active listening. Try and just prepare for that active listening. And if that's not clear, or if that individual feels stuck, find someone to help support you. Find a coach, find a friend, find a group where someone can share with you, be your mirror, you can practice with, but find somebody so that you can then be successful at that conversation, which I know everyone can be. It's just a matter of preparing for it.
Thank you for that one tip, Sheila. Where can people find you?
I am on LinkedIn, Sheila Lambert, and I have my website, which is Lambert Leadership Coaching. And my email is Sheila@Lambert Leadership Coaching. So in any avenue, please reach out. I'm happy to have a consultation.
Thanks so much, Sheila. I really appreciate this conversation, and I know it's going to be probably on my repeat podcast episodes.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Kathy.
Thanks so much for joining us today, and I hope that this has given you some valuable tips on how you can prepare for those difficult conversations so that they become easier and more productive, and also that you're not running away from them and putting your head in the sand, because that is not going to serve you or the business. Also, if you love this episode, you can find all the timestamps, show notes, blog posts, and links on the website, newcastlefinance.us/podcast. And before I go, as always, I do have a favor to ask. If you are listening to this on Apple Podcast, if you could please go to the show and tap the number of stars that you think the show deserves, because this helps other people find it, and it gives that much needed Apple Podcast algorithm love so people can, find it. Thanks so much. Until next time.